with our retrospective part of the event, and Neil Holbrook, Motorway Archaeology, is going to take us through rural highlights from Britannia over the last few decades.
Thank you, Andy. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to take a fairly loose interpretation of looking back, and I also want to look forward. And also, I'm perhaps not totally tied myself to Britannia in my thoughts. But what I did do, which I guess is the time-honoured thing, is go back and look at the first edition of Britannia. But rather than the main journal, I went back and looked at Roman Britain in 1969, the kind of the sites that were being investigated then, at the end of that decade. And it will give you little surprise that the three photos on this slide reflect a big emphasis, which is the excavation of villas. And so Beedlam, Winterton, and at the bottom Barnsley Park in Gloucestershire. And these were all longish running research-ish excavations by big beasts of the time, Ian Stead, Roger Goodburn, Graham Webster. That should have caused us no surprise. The emphasis on the investigation and analysis of Roman villas to the virtual exclusion of all other types of settlement has been so often commented upon now that it perhaps bears no further repetition. And indeed, I think we can probably see this continuing work on villas as part of a long trend going back into the antiquarian era, where villas were investigated for their vestiges of Romano British art and for supposed links with classical culture. But villas were not to the total exclusion in Roman Britain in 1969. There was other work, but perhaps tellingly, it occurs at what you might call the periphery of the Roman province. Burrowden, on the Northumberland coastal plain, just north of Newcastle, was being examined by George Joby. And at the other end of the province, Crane Godevery, near Gwyvion, was being investigated by Charles Thomas. Again, two big names in the archaeology of the era. And these were part rescue, part research. But I think it was telling that these two examples both come from parts of the province where villas are not common, not totally absent, but certainly not common. And one can't help feeling that there was a sort of emphasis that if villas were around, in areas where villas existed, they were privileged ahead of other types of rural settlement. But 1969 also stood at the beginnings of the so-called rescue era. And indeed, in the years that followed the early 1970s, we saw the creation of the professional field units. The one thing about rescue excavation is that it reacts to development. And of course, development doesn't determine which kind of sites it's going to affect. Development happens for reasons affecting to the local economy. But of course, what is conditioned by the time is the response that is given by the funding agencies of the time. And I thought perhaps telling that in 1969 work was ongoing at Mucking on the Thames foreshore in Essex, and this had been ongoing since 1963. Curiously not mentioned in RB in 1969. I think that's an important point, is that don't believe that Roman Britain is in any way a comprehensive sample of all that was done. It's a very partial sample, reflecting those people who choose to contribute. But in many ways, I think the work at Mucking was probably much more inspired by the prehistoric and the Anglo-Saxon archaeology than the Roman. But I chose this example just because after all these decades, the report on the Roman phases at Mucking have now just been published, and with telling detail. And this slide perhaps conjures up the image of the early 70s in a very evocative way. Another thing that happened around that time was the advent of what we might call motorway archaeology. And these slides represent work done by Peter Fowler in advance of the construction of the M5 motorway in Gloucestershire and Somerset. There was other work done, but the M5 was perhaps preeminent there. I think this was transformational, actually. I remember as a very young person hearing a talk, I think it was by Kate Pretty, and she just was so excited by the results of this work of Peter Fowler's, which showed that probably a Roman site was cropping up every 1.5 to 2 miles along these motorways. And I think this was revolutionary because for the first time it really hammered home the fact that there was vastly more Roman rural settlements than had been previously suspected. Indeed, I think Peter was so perhaps doubt at one point. He wondered whether it was perhaps due to the proximity to a Roman road that could explain this. It was so stark that I think anyone had expected that level of resource previously. And indeed, Peter, with characteristic understatement, claimed to have invented the archaeology of lowland Gloucestershire in 2 months in 1970. So I think what you see, perhaps, if we might take the early 1970s, is probably a slightly twin-track approach of continuing research, excavations, examinations, predominantly of villas, and an increasing trend towards the examination of other types of rural settlement in a rescue context. But I think looking through the 70s and into the 80s, I think in the literature, the predominance of villa work still was very much the fore, and Keith Brannigan was a prime mover in that, wrote a number of books at that time. But I think in many ways some of them appear quite dated now. They were certainly heavily architecturally driven, with a lot of discussion of things like plan analysis. But you would say plans drawn from excavations done often in the 19th century. So almost certainly incomplete villa plans, and also invariably very, very poorly dated. The quality of evidence really wasn't great. And I think some of the theories that were expanded at that time, for example, supposed similarities between villa plans in the west of England and those in Gaul as a sign of people fleeing from the barbarian invasions and taking their money into Britain, held little traction now. And certainly I don't think very many people at all, if any, would take the villa plans can be used as evidence for that supposition. I'm going to jump forward a little bit now, from the 70s into the late 1980s, and to Richard Hingley's book of 1989, which I think was incredibly influential. It certainly was to me, because it opened up perhaps a kind of a new way of thinking. For a start, it explicitly placed all categories of rural settlement on a par. So it certainly didn't privilege the villa evidence over that of other farms. And also it showed an interest in aspects of social archaeology, perhaps which had not been hitherto examined in any great detail. So it very much moved away from the architectural dominance. But still, what's telling, looking back at that volume from now, is just how slight the evidence base that Richard had to work from was. Still, in many cases, he was dealing with old excavations, poor quality data, and trying to draw conclusions from that. And you might, for example, look at his ideas of North Warnborough Isle building in Hampshire, where he posited some interesting ideas about male-female use of the building, different types of use inside. But again, the evidence base for that, frankly, is weak. It's a 1930s excavation, and we know next to nothing of the actual contexts from which the artifacts which were used to draw male-female distinction actually came from. So, again, I think it was a transformational book, but still working on a very slight evidence base, and one still dominated by villas. In the same year, this book came out, and I've sort of selected this volume really because I think it stands at the cusp between two different paradigms or methods of analysis. I mean, for a start, the focus on the economies of Romano-British villas rather than other architectural aspects is interesting and perhaps reflects the time. But the methods used to address those issues vary considerably. We might perhaps look at what we call the old methods, and these very much draw back to the work of people like Schirry and Applebaum in the early 1970s, and I think you might perhaps characterise it as informed speculation, in that you take plans of sites and you see if you can perhaps try and draw some inferences from them. And Applebaum, followed by Brannigan, looked at, for example, this site of Pitney in Somerset, and drew some conclusions on the presence of these very long, narrow little rooms. And they drew the conclusion that these could have been pigsties. I think on the basis of one mention of 2 pig teeth in the report. So, first of all, the report was published in 1863. I believe the report was only 2 pages long. And the plan of this villa is clearly incomplete. So I think ideas that you can deduce that that was a pigsty are slight. But that perhaps was the method of plan analysis, trying to draw something from it, but which is frankly probably almost incapable of proof. But if that was the old methods, the newer methods seem to have much more potential. And in that same volume, there were 2 papers, one by Richard Rees and one by Tony King. Richard's paper was on coins from villas in Britain. And in that, he developed his pioneering approach where he looked at a total assemblage basis, the total number of coins found at a site, adopted a systematic scheme of classification, the so-called Rees periods, but then allowed comparison between different kinds of site. And he then began to draw comparisons between the profiles from one to another. So that was new. It was something he'd been working on, but it was evolving. And likewise, Tony King's work looking at the faunal remains, the animal bone remains from villa sites, which drew on work of pioneers such as Barbara Noddle and Mark Maltby, was interesting in that, again, it was overtly quantitative and began to look at differences in the representation of different species at different types of site. For example, he began to look at the prevalence, the slight prevalence of sheep, for example, at that Barnsley Park excavation in Gloucestershire that we saw earlier on. And indeed, it's perhaps telling that, it's telling and encouraging that sort of 25 years on, the work of the Roman Rural Settlement Project by Martin Allen has now perhaps drawn out and confirmed that conclusion that yes, sheep are relatively more prevalent in the Cotswolds and some other parts of the country. You might say that's, well, we all knew that. Well, we didn't actually all know that. It's just nice to have actual evidence rather than speculation. And that then brings me on really to the theme of environmental archaeology and the application of those techniques to the investigation of rural sites. In many ways, environmental archaeology began in early work in the early 1970s by pioneers such as Martin Jones and Mark Robinson, often in sites in the Upper Thames Valley, began to really demonstrate the potential of archaeobotany, the study of seeds, for reconstructing past economies and landscapes. And indeed, it's amazing that now hay meadows are a fairly well-tested event in Roman Britain, but in many ways they seem to have an almost total correlation with sites that Mark had worked on in the early 1970s. So these were being created. But this kind of brings us into the era where I began working. I started working in a rescue unit in the 1980s. And I think the point is, the application of environmental archaeology was incredibly patchy. And there were a few specialists employed by the English Heritage in sort of regional hubs, But where I was in the deep southwest, I think it's fair to say environmental archaeology almost totally passed us by. We weren't massively interested in it, didn't really understand it. And I think the step change in environmental archaeology is one of the things that is sometimes forgotten about when we come to the advent of the present commercial era, which began circa 1990 with the introduction of PPG-16. Not only did the number of sites, investigated, spiraled out of all proportion to what went before, and this slide perhaps just shows you some snapshots from the southwest of England, but it could be virtually anywhere in Britain. But I would just say, perhaps I sometimes refer to it as the Big Bang of archaeology 1990. But I think this bar chart is telling it was quite a slow bang, actually, because it wasn't really until 2000 onwards that actually you see the real upsurge in terms of reporting. But what it did do was that environmental archaeology became the norm, and it was used on virtually every investigation from then on. So I think that was a fairly fundamental point. And I think following on then from the beginnings of the commercial era in 1990, Jeremy Taylor's 2007 survey stands as something which for me really stopped and made me think. Drawing on enhancement work from HGRs, earthworks, fine scouts, etc. He posited that there was something like 100,000 rural settlements in England alone. And that really made me stop, because I'd never really thought about that. And when you begin to think, well, actually, the one site you're perhaps involved in investigating is one of 100,000, it perhaps makes you think about it in a rather different way. And I think that really was a very valuable survey that began to highlight just the sheer size of the resource that we have for the study of the rural countryside. And I think about the same time, Mike Fulford and I then moved towards the formulation of a project that was to become the Roman Rural Settlement Project, which was deliberately designed to really try and capture this huge amount of new data that was being captured through the developer process. And we took an overtly integrative approach where we looked at we hoped to really try and tie in absolutely different types of data, not just structural, finds, environmental, etc. I'm not really going to say too much more about that project. One, because only one of the 3 volumes has been published. The second one comes out in 2 weeks' time, and you can see a flyer for it at the back of the room. And also, I'm perhaps too close to it to really assess its impact. That's for others to do. But what it did do is obviously flag up just the sheer amounts of investigation that have taken place. And this plan shows sites that have been excavated. It's not sites that are known, it's sites that have been excavated. And immediately when you start to look at plans like maps like this, it begs all sorts of questions. What are you looking at? Are you looking at places where archaeologists have worked, or how much does this reflect past distributions? And that's a big and live question. But nevertheless, I think what you do see is just the sheer quantity of information, and also how that is heavily skewed regionally, and I'll come back to that. I think what I would say is that our work, one of the aspects of our work, is that we put grey literature, work produced by the commercial sector, on a par with conventionally published. So the published is in blue, the grey literature is in red. So what you can see is if you'd ignored the grey literature, in parts of the country, you're ignoring half of the available resource open to you. So I think that's an important point to make, that from here on in, you have to capture that information. And perhaps what I would also say is I hope that the database that was created perhaps points the way forward for which future big data projects might be disseminated and the results made available. But I want to come back to this map, really, and I think if there's one sort of headline conclusion of the Rural Settlement Project, is that we cannot talk about the countryside of Roman Britain, because there were many different countrysides of Roman Britain. Regional variation is clearly represented, and indeed we then produce these different areas where we sort of try and see broad groupings, and for example the central belt running from sort of the Wash down to the Severn estuary. I think what in the past, variation in the country of the Roman Britain has often been talked about in terms of environmental determinism, the upland, lowland division, or perhaps indeed areas where the Roman army had a presence and where it didn't. I think, again, what we feel is that perhaps one of the bigger determinants of variation is cultural differences. People had very different attitudes and cultural responses to becoming part of the Roman Empire, and that is very clearly represented in the archaeology of the countryside in which they lived. So I think that's an important thing. I would also draw the distinction that in many ways there's almost two different archaeologies now. The archaeology you can write of this central belt, where there's been so much work has gone on, because this is obviously the heartland of the affluent southeast of England. In areas of Cambridgeshire and places like that, the amount of work is so great that you can really begin to formulate such incredibly fine-grained questions now. Really exciting opportunities for almost a sort of total archaeological landscape. But once you move into the west and into parts of the north where development has not been so prevalent, you are faced with an altogether different picture. And I think very much so, one of the issues is how do you address the archaeology of those areas where there hasn't been anywhere near as much investigation, and indeed perhaps the pace of the formulation of new research questions is much greater in the southeast than it is in the north, if you can draw those from an evidence base. And this is reflected, of course, partly in the prevalence of material culture. Now, this is a portable antiquities map. Again, there's a lot of biases in this that could be discussed, but what I hope it just tries to give a snapshot is that if these white and blue areas are perhaps areas where finds are most prevalent, the other areas where finds are less prevalent. And again, you can see this concentration of material culture, largely in the south and east, stretching up into Yorkshire, but perhaps rather different pattern on the other side of the Pennines, and indeed in the further north. And that prevalence of material culture is a really big deal, because some of the upland archaeology of the north is fantastic. I mean, this is an absolutely stunning survey of a site called Gossip Gate near Alston in Cumbria. But again, there's a clue in the title, Late Iron Age and Romano-British. Is how do you actually differentiate chronologically between late prehistoric and sites occupied during the Roman era, when actually pottery is virtually non-existent on many of these sites. So chronology is a huge problem, one that perhaps can only be countered through extensive programs of radiocarbon dating. But I think when you take somewhere like the lowland areas of Lancashire, for example, the lowland archaeology is really slight. So I think what to try and do is to try and sum up a little bit, is that I've been very struck by what we found in the project and through my reading, but I think there are huge challenges still ahead of us. I think, can we begin to work towards a sort of working model of Roman Britain? Just how did food get from the field to the plate, whether that plate is in a Roman fort, in a Roman villa, or a roundhouse settlement in upland Cumbria? One of the sort of things that worries me at the moment is that in looking through our survey, evidence for the storage of agricultural produce in their countryside is still remarkably slight. You just don't seem to have found granaries, storage buildings on many settlements. How did this material actually get from the farm to centralised distribution points and further beyond? That remains a fundamental question to me. I mean, were there sort of wagon trains travelling up the Roman roads? Who knows? But it does seem to me we are at a fairly pivotal moment now. Archaeology is coming under pressure in the planning process to justify the gains in knowledge in return for the money spent on it. So we have a real duty now to try and explain the public benefit of what we're doing in return for planning obligations. No two sites are the same, that's obvious. But if we really are to maximise the benefit of what we're doing, we need to be able to extract data in common ways that allow comparison between different sites and different regions. That's absolutely fundamental, and we still really struggle, for example, in pottery in that area. I've spoken a lot about investigation, because that's kind of the world in which I come from, but I would say is I think just as the evidence base grows for investigation, there's a dramatic need for further theoretical underpinning, new ideas about how we should approach the countryside. You know, the work of Jeremy Taylor, for instance, is really interesting. We need a lot more of that, because the evidence base is vast. And you know, if we need to get away from any kind of concept of an intellectual plateau around the British countryside, we need to get new investigations to be inspired by new thoughts and new ideas. But I would in finishing, what I would say is that just because the evidence base is so great, we have the potential for everyone to play. All different parts of our discipline, commercial, academic, independent, can all play in this area. And what I do know is that when the different sectors of our discipline collaborate, we're so much stronger for it. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Neil. Fantastic. Time for, again, sort of one quick question, perhaps? Yes.
I found the diagram of all the different sites that have been excavated really fascinating. Do you know how well connected all those different sites are? In terms of roads, have you found evidence of roads as well?
Oh yes, I mean there are roads, but equally, very clearly, there are many sites that lie well off the Roman road system. But I think you can almost begin to plot, into some degree, these sort of almost like the arteries of Roman Britain, in which the material culture does begin to flow up the main highways of the province. And indeed, once you get it, almost, I'm sure if you could demonstrate this, that the further you get from Roman road, often the prevalence of material culture begins to diminish from that. But it's very clear there were rural settlements virtually everywhere, and in parts well away from the main arterial roads of the province, but how they were connected, presumably through trackways, just droving over common land, who knows?
Thank you very much. So I think we better move on to our final speaker for the morning session.